President Emmerson Mnangagwa's trip to Glasgow, Scotland, where he attended the COP26 Climate Change Summit, has generated debate both locally and globally. You know, this conference is usually held physically, but this year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, some leaders attended physically, some attended virtually, and our president was among the leaders who attended the conference physically. A lot of debate has been generated from the summit, from our government's attendance to the summit. And a lot of people have been asking whether it really benefits us as a country that we attended this. And to answer some of these questions, we're joined in the studio today by political scientist Richard Mahomva. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To start off this conversation, what does it mean politically for us to attend this conference?
The starting point, the broad thematic point is that of climate justice, and the issue of climate justice constitutes a huge fraction of the global political economy policy making. So it means that Zimbabwe is taking part in deciding important issues at the level of world affairs. And it also suggests that we have got an inclusive input into the broader global discourse. For me, that is what it means as a nation. Sanctions on Zimbabwe alongside America. And the fact that we have a UN platform in the UK and Zimbabwe is invited, it actually speaks to the superseding function of the United Nations and not necessarily improved relations with Britain. But what should Zimbabwe do? Zimbabwe should then extend its negotiation platform with the United Nations to say, in as much as we are allowed to have certain conversations in countries that have got prejudice over us, you need to engage these countries
now,
to pull away
Richard,
sanctions.
Talking about engagement, you mentioned as a starting point that this was a climate change summit, right? And as Zimbabwe, we're talking about engagement and re-engagement, and the president is moving with the notion that Zimbabwe is a friend to all and an enemy to none. But is this the right platform for us to engage and re-engage?
Look, the engagement and re-engagement, Zimbabwe is open for business. Those are the flagships of our foreign policy. If we're given any platform, we are bound. We have got that policy conviction to speak about that. And look, the issue of engagement and re-engagement also speaks to the issue of climate justice, because remember, Zimbabwe is a voice of the post-colonies since the land reform program. So when Zimbabwe goes to a climate justice platform, it is re-engaging even on that particular aspect. So the subject of engagement and re-engagement is a broad-based subject, which is not necessarily confined to the issues of sanctions, because the issue of climate change and its origins within West emitters speaks to the uneven global order. And Zimbabwe is going to engage at that level as a victim of the climate change dynamics.
But you think the ordinary person at home understands what COP26 is all about, understand what climate change issues are all about? Does this really apply to the ordinary person at home?
It applies in the sense that we have had a series of droughts, which are a result of climate change, and drought directly affects the politics of the stomach. So I think the only challenge that we have is broad-based mainstreaming or broad articulation of some of these issues to say, what does it mean when Zimbabwe takes part in a climate change platform, because we are facing those effects of climate change. And you'd also notice that even through these global climate discussions, there have been debates about whether coal should continue being used for electricity generation, and what does that mean for a country like Zimbabwe that has got huge coal deposits. So it affects our economic base.
Now, looking at, again, re-engagement, we know that the president met the EU Council President Charles Michael at the summit, and he later on tweeted about his meeting with the president. Does this again speak to the changing relations maybe between Zimbabwe and the EU?
Probably you would notice that there's been a stalemate between ourselves and the EU, but the EU also realizing our potential or what it stands to benefit from Zimbabwe. So I think there is realization from the West that it stands to benefit by giving in to good relations with Zimbabwe. I'll take you back to the pre-ISAP era, where we were actually exporting our beef and many of our natural resource items to the European market. And look, Europe cannot survive without the input of the African continent. So it has to open up to Zimbabwe. So that gesture by the EU official is substantial of how much the West depends on African economies.
But do you really think that the West really understands or really believes that, or do you really, really believe that they cannot do without us, especially considering how they've imposed sanctions on us?
Look, historically, the development of the West was at the expense of Africa's underdevelopment. If you are to look at the human capital that we are producing in our health sector, in our colleges, these are people whose skills are convertible to the colonial currencies. That is why our nurses have got a market in Canada, in Australia, in the UK. So our human capital only is explicit of the extent to which we are a strategic resource to the Western world. So let alone without even mentioning minerals, without even mentioning our agricultural sector. So the West depends on us.
So who needs who more here?
It definitely needs us as a continent, not only as Zimbabwe, because their development is predicated on our underdevelopment. Needless to be emphatic on things like slavery and colonialism and the economic effects that those two processes had to humanity at large.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the message on the lifting of sanctions is being heard?
Sure, because the fact that you've got an entire continent speaking out, needless to emphasize that Africans have spoken and Africans are still speaking and Africans are never going to stop speaking
and
until
what
equality
does
is
speaking
achieved.
help? Because remember, on the 25th of October, that was the anti-sanctions day set aside by SADC and other countries that were standing with us in the lifting of sanctions. And the general person at home will ask, what does it help for us to continuously ask for them to be lifted?
If the speaking is useless, then the United States Embassy would not be speaking back to us. So the speaking is helping. It's getting a certain policy message across. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is very important.
Mm-hmm. But then, you know, what people have said on social media, this was actually a meme on social media. Okay, you've made noise about this on the 25th and the whole of October. Jabatsre.
There are certain sections of our people who speak ill of their country. And it's normal in the sense that we are a people whose identity is reproduced by views of colonialism, where you've got an entire, a journalist committed to the demonization of their country. For instance, you would also hear issues particularly emanating from the engagement at COP26. You'd hear certain individuals saying, well, the president addressed an empty audience. And they omit the fact that it was a hybrid platform, which was actually online. So you've got certain people that have embraced so much negativity.
I was going to talk about that
country.
a little later, but then seeing that we've just talked about it, let's talk about it now. People on social media talked about how the president addressed so-called empty auditorium. And you're saying this is because this is the digital era and some people attended virtually. But did we take time to maybe compare with other leaders? African leaders, to be precise?
Probably comparison or no comparison. But the fact that has to be understood is that in as much as someone is saying they witnessed that the president addressed an empty auditorium, it means they were part of a virtual audience. So the world is moving towards that, and it's archaic for anyone to expect that you need to have physical audience at a time when events are being held virtually, and at a time when we are fighting COVID. It actually defeats the entire purpose. It's an argument that really holds no water in my view. At a time when we're being contemporary in the method that we convene events.
Let's still look at the way the media covered the president's trip. to Glasgow. We talked about the issue of the so-called empty auditorium. The president was seen in photos with various world leaders, and various media platforms had different things to say about such happenings. What does it say of us as the people, as the media?
Our media is guided by what I've referred to as split patriotic consciousness.
What is that?
And by split patriotic consciousness, you would notice that ever since we took the land reform, Zimbabwe has been divided into two political constituencies: the pro-land reform constituency and the anti-land reform constituency, the pro-sanctions constituency and the anti-sanctions constituency, the superficial corruption-guided narrative constituency. And so we have got these realities, but these realities are also drawn from political divides that we have as a country, in the sense that you have got a certain section that has got this emphatic dislike for ZANU-PF on partisan perspectives, and this emphatic dislike for ZANU-PF culminates in the constant orchestration of the demonization of the leader of ZANU-PF. And how do you explain that? The so-called demonstrations that were said to be covered speak to that reality. But I then dare ask that, why are we emphasizing much on this media that is more demonizing and ignoring other similar initiatives that were pro the president, that were actually held on the sidelines? So it means that probably there is need for extended media messaging on pro-government, media institutions. So what is it that pro-government media messaging is not doing right to a point of being overridden by a single Hopewell Chinono?
But then is it wrong to have opposing voices?
No, it's actually correct, but the point is, what is it that the pro-government media is not doing right?
Mm-hmm. You're watching Inside Out on ZBC News Online, and today on the program we're joined by political analyst, scientist Richard Mahlahla, who is helping us look into the issue of COP26 summit, which the president had attended. Is actually coming back today and a minute from now, and we're looking at how the summit helped us as a country in as far as our engagement and re-engagement drive is concerned. Zimbabwe is a friend to all and an enemy to none. We should take a short break. Join us when we return. You're still watching Inside Out. Thank you for joining us. Before we took the break, we were just explaining to us the way the media covered this whole Glasgow trip. Now let's look at the so-called demonstrations. You touched on this earlier on. It looks like some people were expecting other people there to demonstrate against the president. To what end?
To what end? To soil the image of Zimbabwe, to sustain sanctions and to sustain the colonial narrative about Zimbabwe, the colonial narrative that hates our self-determination to gain the land. And in any case, you ask yourself, who are these people who demonstrated? Because the viral videos, to me, only show that it's just less than 20, 30 people that did that. And when we are talking about the media, we are only focused on probably one or two, social media sites such as your ZimEye, which is a properly anti-government type of media.
You have to acknowledge, though, that in this day and age, social media counts.
It does, but not only that. When we discuss the media, we also omit the fact that Herald was also covering. It had a chain of headlines that spoke to the positive issues. And I'm just thinking, if we have got progressive media in this country, which we want to use as our center of analysis, why do we see only negative things coming from that side of the media that we are too much fixated on, and forgetting that. So you can't tell me that a Herald was running a positive monologue. But not only that, I anticipate a situation whereby ZimEye, if it is a fair media platform, also covered the commemorative side of things, because look, we have got certain Zimbabweans, and especially the just to be blunt, we know that for a common cause there is the ZANU-PF district in the United Kingdom. They had the commemorative side. So why are we only focused on the demonstrations and not the commemorative side
but
of
you talked about
the president's
progressive media.
visit?
Who defines progressive media?
Progressive media is media that paints positively the image of one's country. Progressive media is one that problematizes the faults of those in power, but also counterbalances that with the good of what they are doing. But in our case, we have got these few media houses who focus on the negative, and there is no counterbalance of the positive. So in my view, that is not progressive. Yourselves are progressive in the sense that you look at the positive side and the negative side. This platform is evident of how positive and how progressive you are, because you are opening up dialogue to the negative and the positive, which should happen in any progressive democratic space, because democracy is a conversation of dissenting voices. You are not agreeing with me.
No, I didn't say I'm not agreeing with you. I'm just saying,
it's evident of our democracy.
This is okay, fine. Yeah. But this one conversation that we've touched on now, the one on who defines progressive media and who doesn't, what does it stand for and what it doesn't, are we a progressive part of that? I really think that's a conversation that I really have to invite you on one day so that we have, because it's a whole topic on its own. Now, coming back to COP26, the developments appear to be very positive for Zimbabwe, looking at the meetings and the engagements that the president had. And then there seems to be opposing voices to the Second Republic and this Glasgow trip and the re-engagement motive by the president and the delegation that went there. Why is that so?
There are two agendas. There is an agenda that wants to see Zimbabwe winning at the international stage. There is also an agenda that wants to see Zimbabwe, and especially the ZANU-PF government, being unpopular at a global stage. So you have got two agenda settings that speak to the type of foreign policy that we want. Because let us not forget that we are here within the sanctions regime because there is a certain political party that was actually founded to defend that. And it becomes irrelevant if it's not defending sanctions. It becomes irrelevant if it speaks of the good governance that Zimbabwe is going through. It becomes irrelevant if it speaks of the governance reforms, because the issue of Zidera is predicated on an imagined sense of democracy, deficits, economic patronage, and all of that. But now, if these things are emphasized, that, look, the new dispensation has brought reform in these aspects, it then defeats the agenda of a certain political party position.
And what does that certain political party gain by defending these sanctions?
It gains a lot in the sense that it is given international audience. And how does this international audience accrue dividends? You have seen how much you have got an NGO industry, a very flourishing NGO industry that is actually bent on pointing out the negatives about governance in Zimbabwe. And that is the very same NGO industry whose veins of expenditure speak into the financing of that political party. Because from the outset, when that very same political party was formed, it was formed by disgruntled white farmers who are still fighting for land to be returned to white farmers, because it is known that in the land there is your minerals. It is known that in the land there is your products that feed into the European market. We are sanctioned because the white people somewhere in Europe and in America do not want me and you to produce food that gets into their economies. So that is an issue of, an embedded racial prejudice that we are confronted with. It's bigger than ZANU-PF and maladministration, but it speaks to the deep-rooted racial constructs of our economic architecture.
Now, let's look at the president's address. Your key takeaways?
He is the fact that he went to that platform, you'd have chosen to say, okay, the fact that it's in the UK, a country that has created sanctions, that have paralyzed the health sector, a country that has created sanctions that have crippled the education sector. I'm not going to go there. But he submitted himself to the call of humanity and said, I will go and speak out. So for me, it speaks to his humility, and leadership is humility. And the emphasis on the sanctions message was very clear, and it's a position that says, you know what, if we are to engage at any level, we are going to engage at the level of our terms, and terms that are pro the decolonization agenda. And for me, that is quite seminal from his presentation, and saying, look, in as much as we welcomed you as Africans to the point of dehumanizing us, denigrating us through colonialism, today we are even coming back to you after you have imposed sanctions to say, you know what, we are willing to engage you. And to me, that is very seminal.
Okay. Decolonization and us being, I don't know, excited, if excited is the word, us being excited that we're invited to UK and here we are talking about decolonization. What does it say about it?
It's not excitement.
What is it?
But it is welcoming a gesture to dialogue. And that represents an essence of Ubuntu and indicating that our politics is predicated on Ubuntu, that no matter how much you paralyze our economy, hemorrhage it, but we are willing to engage with you. And you would notice that such a process explains how much we are rehumanizing ourselves in response to the dehumanization that has been experienced by our people from slavery, colonialism, and even when we demanded the land, which is our birthright. So it's a process of rehumanization.
A process of rehumanization, you said. The president, going back to his speech, he talked about sincerity and honesty in the part of world leaders who pledged to reduce pollution. Do you then think that this summit is enough? Is it once-off thing, once a year?
I think Africans, in as much as Africans, especially in the SADC, you have caucused against sanctions. We need another caucus, another movement, an anti-climate injustice voice that also supports our voices as far as the sanctions issue is concerned. So that was a good starting point around sanctions, but we need to take it further and speak against climate injustice and also speak against other, injustices that contribute to the uneven relationship of Zimbabwe, Africa, and the colonial world.
So do you think the African voice was well represented at this summit?
I think that the African voice, yes, was represented because, look, the president represents a country that stood against the ego of whiteness through the taking away of the land. So I think Africa was well represented in that perspective.
Okay, Richard, your parting words as we conclude the program regarding Zimbabwe's engagement and re-engagement drive that we talked about, the president's attendance to the COP26 summit.
I think the notion of engagement should be predicated on sincere love to the idea of decolonization. Whenever we are asked to engage, we should engage in very decolonial terms, and we must not be found conforming to the whims of IMF, World Bank dictates on how we should govern ourselves, but we should be predicated on African values of, defining ourselves and the destiny that we want for Africa and our country.
But do you think as Africans we understand those values? Because in order for us to be able to impart them to other people, or to allow them to bind us, we should understand what Africanness is all about.
We need to, and that is the only pathway to rehumanizing ourselves. And it's a process that we should live daily. And the Africa Day should be every day. It should not be 25 May. And every month should be Black History Month and not the month of February. So we should be African everywhere, be it at COP26, be it at the United Nations. We should be African everywhere and every day.
Indeed, we should be African everywhere and every day. The words of Richard Mahomva, the political scientist, joining us in the studio today on Inside Out, but looking particularly at the President's trip to Glasgow, Scotland, where he attended the COP26 Climate Change Summit. Richard, thank you for having joined us.
Thank you for having me.
It is always a pleasure having you. I hope you'll come back again one day so that we talk about progressive media.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for having joined us. Until we meet again, hopefully next week. Pleasant viewing.